In 1820, Thomas Love Peacock wrote an essay called The Four Ages of Poetry in the Literary Miscellany. Peacock argued that poetry goes through four stages, similar to the stages of human life. These stages are the age of iron. In the age of iron, poetry is raw and unrefined, like early folk ballads and medieval romances similar to childhood. Second is the age of gold. In this age, poetry reaches its peak, showing creative power like the epic and tragic poetry of ancient Greece and Renaissance Europe, similar to youth. The third age is the age of silver, where poetry's creativity is constrained by rules like the works of Virgil, Lucretius, Dryden, and Pope, similar to Middle Age. Finally, the age of bronze. Poetry becomes overly simplistic and artificial, reflecting its decline, like the later classical period and the work of poets like Wordsworth, Scott, and Byron, similar to Old Age. Peacock believed that as society advanced, poetry declined and was no longer worth pursuing. He thought that intelligent people should focus on natural and social sciences instead. This view upset Shelley, who called Peacock's essay a heresy and a harsh criticism of poetry. In response, Shelley wrote a defense of poetry in 1821. He argued against Peacock's view, claiming that human civilization is built not on reason but on imagination. According to Shelley, it is poets, not reasoners, who shape history. He aimed to define what poetry is and how it is created and its impact on individuals and society. Shelley's work was a counter to Peacock's view that poetry was declining and irrelevant in a practical age. Shelley begins the essay by explaining two concepts, reason and imagination. Reason involves analyzing known information, while imagination creates and understands new ideas. Poetry, according to Shelley, is the expression of imagination. Shelley uses ideas from Plato to argue that imagination connects with the deeper ideal realm. Poets touch this eternal truth and express life in its purest form. For Shelley, poetry is not just about poems but includes any creative expression. Poets shape language, laws, societies, religions, and the arts, reflecting the ideal order. Anyone who enriches human civilization with creativity is a poet, while those without this creative spark contribute nothing significant. Shelley narrows down the definition of poetry to written language that uses rhythm and measure. He argues that poetry is not just found in formal verse. Even prose writers like Plato and Bacon use measured language and are poets in their way. Poetry often uses metaphorical language, which can become stale over time. New poets are needed to refresh these metaphors and keep language alive for meaningful communication. Shelley also notes that poetry relies on inspiration, which is not under conscious control. Unlike logical reasoning, poetry comes from moments of spontaneous creativity. The best poetry captures these brief moments of inspiration rather than being the result of deliberate effort and hard work. One of Shelley's most mature insights is that moral systems and ethical codes alone cannot bring about a revolution. If they could, the world would already be a paradise. He believes that for true change to happen, people's hearts and minds need to be prepared first, and he sees poetry as the key to this transformation. This idea reflects a romantic view that gives poetry a religious function, an idea also present in Wordsworth's writings and further developed by Shelley, eventually culminating in Arnold's idea of replacing religion with poetry. Shelley believes poetry transforms people by providing pleasure, not just any pleasure, but higher, nobler kind that combines wisdom and delight. This special kind of pleasure comes from the poet's contact with eternal truths and their ability to make readers share in this experience. By doing this, poetry awakens and strengthens the imagination, which Shelley sees as the foundation of moral goodness. Shelley argues that love is the great secret of morals. To be truly good, a person must imagine intensely and comprehensively, putting themselves in the place of others and sharing their pains and pleasures. The imagination is the great instrument of moral good, and poetry strengthens it, just as exercise strengthens the limbs. This imaginative faculty, which is central to our moral nature, needs to be nurtured to prevent society and individuals from becoming corrupt and stagnant. Shelley supports his argument by briefly surveying the role of poetry in human civilization, concluding that poetry has always been behind everything valuable in human history. In the modern age, poetry's role is even more crucial because the rise of the rational, calculating thought and increasing mechanization corrupting and dehumanizing humanity. Poetry can rescue modern civilization from this doom by cultivating the internal laws of human nature when eternal material accumulation surpasses the power to assimilate it. Contrary to Peacock's claim that poetry is in decline, Shelley sees a resurgence of creativity in his time. He concludes the essay by asserting that poets are like prophets who reveal future possibilities and inspire change, even if they don't fully understand or feel the impact of their work. He famously declares that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Shelley's poetry itself illustrates the role he envisions for poetry, using it as a tool for reform. His work, from short lyrics to long poems and dramatic compositions, is filled with revolutionary passion. His ideal poet sings unbidden hymns until the world responds to hopes and fears it previously ignored. Beneath his poetic fervor lies an ideological structure influenced by the Platonic idea that a single principle governs the universe. Poetry is not just art, it is a vision of the perfect form of things. Poetry is integral to civilization's evolution from primitive barbarism and links literary decline to social decay, as seen in his critique of Restoration comedy. When the ideal order fails, poetry also falls from its heights. Thus, Shelley attributes deep philosophical and moral values to poetry. The value of Shelley's essay lies not only in re-establishing poetry as a crucial part of society and history, but also in refuting Peacock's view that English poetry has passed through four declining ages. Shelley highlights the intrinsic value of poetic understanding of life and the unique language of poetry. The main challenge in understanding Shelley's essay is its grand style and subjective assertions. The language is unmistakably romantic. However, sympathetic imagination, one can see that it is not vague or imprecise as it might seem. Shelley's framework is romantic, not rational or scientific. He believes poetry comes from inspiration, but also needs unity and organization. Poetry is not just chaotic emotion, it requires discipline through meter and versification. Shelley, like other romantic critics, sees no distinction between the poet and poetry. For him, poetry is a universal quality, not just confined to verse, and his declaration that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world extends this principle.